One of Washington's principal concerns in post-Assad Syria is preventing the re-emergence of the Islamic State terrorist group. The hardline Islamist movement was spawned a decade ago in the chaos of Syria's civil war. Syrian Kurds, supported by the US, played a role in their defeat.
Almost immediately, as rebel forces reached Damascus on Sunday to topple President Bashar al-Assad's regime, US forces conducted precision airstrikes in Syria. As part of the operation, American warplanes struck more than 75 targets. Officials said the strikes were part of their ongoing mission to prevent the so-called Islamic State, also known as IS or ISIS, from reconstituting in central Syria.
You can expect that that kind of activity will continue. We don't want to give ISIS an opportunity to exploit what's going on. They love nothing more than ungoverned space.
IS is a terrorist group bent on establishing a global caliphate. It rose to prominence in 2014 when its forces took advantage of the ongoing Syrian war to seize vast swaths of territory. At its height in 2014, it held about a third of Syria and 40% of Iraq. It conducted terrorist attacks worldwide, killing and injuring thousands, and destroyed cultural heritage on an unprecedented scale. Kurdish forces have played an essential role in helping the United States and other countries battle IS for more than a decade. The group's territory and military capabilities were largely contained and disabled by 2019, but they were never completely eradicated, with many fighters going underground. In the years since, as Syria's civil war stagnated, the Kurds, with US backing, have operated prisons filled with fighters accused of being IS terrorists. But neighboring Turkey views armed Kurds so close to its border as a threat and has backed renewed attacks against them in recent days. The US has repeatedly said that it is committed to the enduring defeat of IS. But with a change of administration looming in Washington, many question whether that commitment will hold.
Whatever the Biden administration might set as policy now could certainly change after January 27th, once Trump takes office. Trump himself has said that he wants to see how the situation plays out on the ground. He doesn't necessarily see a large role for the United States, but will that mean that he takes those troops out?
Around 900 American troops are currently stationed in eastern Syria. The question now is, for how much longer?
Well, let's explore some of those issues with Professor Natasha Lindstedt, who teaches international relations and comparative politics at the University of Essex in the UK. She has a special interest in Middle East politics. Welcome to DW, Professor. Is Islamic State really able to exploit what's going on in Syria at the moment, as the US fears?
So that is definitely a concern, particularly because Trump has already signaled that the U.S. Won't likely have anything to do with Syria, that the U.S. may need to get out of Syria. And as the report mentioned, there are 900 troops there. In 2019, Trump removed many U.S. troops that were there. So this number is smaller than it was before because Trump sees, as part of his America First agenda, that the U.S. gets troops out of different parts of the world where he thinks this is too costly for the U.S. And there are two camps in the Trump administration, the future Trump administration. One would be the camp that sees the Islamic State as incredibly dangerous, and therefore U.S. troops need to remain there to prevent it from emerging again. And then the other camp, which Trump leads, is that feels that the U.S. is overburdened by these military expenditures. And the Islamic State at one point had 30% of Syria's territory, 40% of Iraq's territory, or basically the size of Belgium. And so it was an enormous force, and it was with the support of the U.S. and the Syrian Democratic forces, which are Kurdish, that enabled the Islamic State, or that pushed the Islamic State basically underground. So right. Without that U.S. backing, that there's real questions about what's going to happen.
And we've seen that the US and Turkey are backing opposing sides who are still fighting in the north of Syria. So what sort of assurances will the two sides, Ankara and Washington, be seeking from each other?
So that was part of the purpose of Secretary of State Anthony Blinken's visit to the Middle East, meeting with Erdogan in person about these concerns. And Erdogan had basically said that Turkey is committed to fighting all terrorist forces. But the problem is that Turkey views the Syrian Democratic Forces, which are Kurdish, as I mentioned, as a terrorist group or as aligned with the PKK. And in the past, Erdogan has been willing to, at the very least, look the other way at whatever the Islamic State's activities, with some reports claiming that Erdogan has supported the Islamic State directly, or at least refused to engage in any kind of counterterror activities. So there are opposing issues here. For the U.S., they view the Islamic State as the biggest threat and would want to continue to support, at least under the Biden administration, continue to support.
It's because I really wanted to, and time is short, I really wanted to cut to the heart of what each side wants from the other. What does Washington want from Ankara? What does Ankara want from Washington?
So the U.S. wants Turkey to prevent the emergence of the Islamic State. That is the biggest threat there for the U.S. And Turkey wants the Kurdish forces to be essentially eliminated.
Okay, thank you. So now we have this traditional government led by Mohammed al-Bashir being built in Damascus to replace the Assad regime. We have fighting in the north continuing as it did under Assad. Is it right to talk of a power vacuum in Syria?
I think you have to assume that there will be, at the very least, instability and insecurity, because in any regime that is undergoing a transition, it's very difficult when there's a lot of different rebel groups, and this rebel group is really more of an umbrella of different groups. Even though at the helm you have Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. These types of transitions are particularly difficult when you have so many different groups jockeying for power, and Syria itself is so complex demographically.
And so do we presume then that the factions that we talked about fighting in the north, do they recognise this new authority in Damascus?
So far what we've seen from the Kurds, and this has been one of the groups that has suffered the most recently with Turkey. Turkey's been the big winner here. And so politically speaking, the Kurds are really struggling because they have made a lot of different deals and now their future is uncertain. And so they have claimed that they are willing to engage in a ceasefire and they are open to some sort of negotiations.
And meanwhile, we have thousands of IS fighters still in Kurdish-run prisons. What is likely to happen to them?
It is really hard to predict what is going to happen to all of these ISIS fighters that are really crammed into these prisons. There were attempts about 2.5 years ago. There was an attempt by the Islamic State to try to free these fighters from these prisons, and the Kurdish forces were able to stomp down on this attempt. But the Kurds themselves are probably going to be facing other challenges. Either from the Syrian National Army, which is backed by Turkey, even though there is, for the moment, some sort of ceasefire. And without that attention to guarding these prisons, which is incredibly arduous, there's questions about what will happen to these fighters that are in the prisons at the moment.
Professor Lindstedt from the University of Essex, thank you so much for leading us through what is clearly a very complicated situation. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Hans-Jakob Schindler is the Senior Director of the Counter-Extremism Project here in Berlin. Hans, good to see you again. Now, how much of a threat does the so-called Islamic State still pose in Syria today?
Well, I mean, it's very clear that at the moment, as it currently stands, it doesn't have enough resources and fighters to hold any territory. But it is also clear that over the last 12 to 14 months, every month, IS in Syria was able to conduct more and more terror attacks, which means there is an existing cell network structure that it allows it to act as a terrorist operation, but not yet to control territory. The real risk is, are the Kurds really weakened enough that Al-Hol, the big IDP camp, or any of the Kurdish prisons, that they hold around 25,000 individuals linked to ISIS, so the fighters and their families, are they going to lose security, and are we going to see prison breaks like we did in 2022 from IS when they attacked the Hasaka prison in Kurdish areas?
Yeah, I mean, Kurds are fighting Turkish-backed militias in the northeast where those camps are. Does Turkey have any interest in that kind of an opportunity for IS in a neighboring country?
No, of course Turkey doesn't. There have been IS attacks in Turkey over the last few years fairly regularly, not quite as bad as Europe, but there have been. But for Turkey, the priority is no Kurdish fighters at the border of Syria and Turkey, and definitely no autonomy, no self-rule of the Kurdish areas in Syria, lest the Kurds in Turkey would get similar ideas. So there is a real priority here, and it seems Turkey, at this point at least, seems to be willing to take the risk that the Kurds lose control over some, at least, of the security installations that hold ISIS individuals.
We heard John Kirby there say that IS likes nothing more than an ungoverned space. Are the rebels fully in control of the country, or is there a power vacuum that IS could exploit?
Well, no one is in control of the entire country at this point. There is the HTS coalition, which governs Idlib and has control has taken control over the government areas, which is quite a big part of Syria, but it doesn't have taken full control. It has only about 30,000 fighters, and it's a lot of cities and villages to control. Then there are the Kurds. Their area is slowly shrinking. There have been attacks in Manbij over the last weekend by Turkish-backed forces. There's a Turkish military operation in Kobani ongoing. And then, of course, there is this Syrian National Army, this Turkish-backed group, which operates along the border of Syria and Turkey. So there's really three spaces here, and the former government areas are not yet fully under control of HTS, not because government forces are resisting, simply because the coalition doesn't have enough fighters to control all the villages and cities in that quite large part of Syria.
The U.S. has targeted a number of suspected IS bases across Syria over the last few days. What can you tell us about those strikes?
Well, it was very clear that two things are going on. The Israelis are removing all of the strategic weapons that the Syrian regime army had to make sure that whoever governs Damascus is not able to use these immediately to attack Israel, while the Americans, as they have done in the past, are concentrating exclusively on ISIS cells, ISIS network nodes, ISIS concentrations of fighters, to make sure that ISIS cannot take advantage of a potential chaos, time of insecurity, loss of control over certain areas of Syria, to not being able to challenge the security of those installations that the Kurds are securing at the moment, while they continue simultaneously fighting both Turkey and the Turkey-backed Syrian National Army, and B, that these cells are not as free to operate as they did in the last couple of months.
Now, IS is considered an Islamist terrorist organization by the U.S. and many other states, but so is HTS, and they have vowed to rule with moderation. They do have a jihadist past, though. So how concerned are the U.S. and other Western states about them being much more radical than they let on?
I think there's two issues to consider here. So one is, of course, the ideology of HTS, which is extremist Islamist, regardless of what Mr. Jolani and Mr. Bashar, the new prime minister, interim prime minister of Syria, say. But even if they are absolutely serious in what they're saying, and we all hope they are, HTS is part of a coalition, and that coalition includes groups like Ahrar al-Sham or the Turkestan Islamic Party, who are absolutely fully hardcore extremist Islamists part officially still, as far as the Turkestan Islamic Party is concerned, of the Al-Qaeda network. Now, these groups fought, bled, and died together with HTS. They are going to ask for a share in power, and their ideology, to a certain extent, will have to be accommodated by HTS, or HTS is risking an internal fight within its own coalition and therefore even more loss of control.
That was Hans-Jakob Schindler. Always great speaking to you. Thank you so much for those insights.
Thank you so much.